who became one of the century's greatest sopranos. Flagstad was born in 1895. In the mid-30s, she went to New York, where she became an overnight sensation at the Metropolitan Opera House, creating a worldwide Wagner renaissance. But as you'll see, from there on, Flagstad's path wasn't easy. First, she hated the fame and the public limelight. Then her career was put on hold in 1941, when she returned to Nazi-occupied Norway and became embroiled in controversy. Flagstad died in 1962, and these days her story and her opulent voice are celebrated in Norway and throughout the opera world. But tonight's marvellous program goes back in time through archival footage and interviews to recreate the tumultuous and brilliant career of Kirsten Flagstad.
Jeg syns ikke at mitt liv angår andre enn meg selv. Jeg bryr meg ikke det minste om mitt rykte når jeg slutter å synge. Jeg kunne like gjerne være død når jeg trekker meg tilbake fra opera- og konsertarbeidet. En kunstners udødelighet betyr ingenting for meg. Ære og berømmelse er kun tomme, meningsløse ord. Man gjør det man kan. For meg vil alt oppstyret opphøre den dagen jeg slutter å synge.
December 1934, the 39-year-old Norwegian singer Kirsten Flagstad set out across the Atlantic. Her career had already spanned 20 years on the Scandinavian music scene and was now taking her to the Metropolitan in New York. In America, Kirsten Flagstad became an overnight success. Her Wagner performances were so innovative that they contributed to a worldwide Wagner renaissance.
Mitt første møte med Wagner fant sted på min 10-års fødselsdag. Av mine foreldre fikk jeg partituret til Lohengrin. Jeg satte med en gang i å lære meg det hele fra begynnelse til slutt. Jeg memorerte hele Elsa-rollen og sang og spilte den for meg selv. Mor og far syntes det var fornøyelig å se at gaven ble satt pris på, og fortsatte med å gi meg partiturer i presang.
Her parents, Maja and Mikael, were both professional musicians and discovered early on that Kirsten had a gift for music. But she was not going to be a singer, they decided. One thing is certain, said Maja Flagstad. None of my 4 children will become musicians. But that is what they all became. Maja was an energetic perfectionist who made sure Kirsten kept up her piano practice. At her confirmation, Kirsten accompanied herself in Elsa's Dream from Lohengrin. One guest, the singing teacher Ellen Schitter Jakobsen, was so impressed she asked Maja's permission to give Kirsten singing lessons. Kirsten had regular lessons with Jakobsen and discovered she was a fast learner, but she would not become a singer. Destiny would prove her wrong. In 1913, she turned 18 and had already learned 30 opera roles by heart, all by herself. That year she made her debut at Oslo's National Theatre, singing the role of Nuri in Dalberg's Tiefland. After studying in Stockholm, she returned to Oslo, where she sang a wide range of music. Musicals, operettas, opera and oratorio.
Det hun ikke visste da, men som hun har selvfølgelig senere har erkjent, det var at det var en veldig god trening for henne. Trening i å bruke stemmen, og trening i å opptre på scenen. For uten den hadde hun jo aldri nådd så langt som hun gjorde.
In 1918, Flagstad married Sigurd Hall, and in 1920, little Elsa was born. Kirsten wanted to be a full-time housewife from then on. Singing would just be an accompaniment to housework. It didn't turn out as she had planned. She was persuaded to perform again and was soon as busy as before. She became a favourite with audiences in Oslo.
Så begynte Sigurd Halls forretning å gå dårlig, og Kirsten ble overarbeidet. Men etter hvert som ekteskapet begynte å skrante, så skjønte hun altså at hun måtte synge for å leve. Så de ble separert etter 8 år.
In 1928, Flagstad was offered an engagement with the Stora Theatre in Gothenburg. For 2 years there, she continued to improve as a singer and as an actor. She was entrusted with major roles in Tosca, Aida and Otello, and received sparkling reviews for her interpretations. In 1929, the Norwegian opera asked her to sing Elsa in Wagner's Lohengrin at a summer concert at the National Theatre. This performance not only advanced her artistic career, it also brought personal happiness.
Og der kommer hun ut på balkongen, eller svalgangen, rett og slett. Tror det er anakt. Man synger «Euch luften wie mein Klagen». Og nede i orkesterplass sitter en herre ved navn Henry Johansen. Han hadde nemlig gitt finansiell støtte til Norsk Operasangforbunds oppførelse av Lohengrin. Og i det hun kommer ut på svalgangen, så fanger han hennes oppmerksomhet helt og holdent.
Henry Johansen was a widower and a well-to-do businessman with a beautiful home in Tiedmannsgate. Flagstad was exhausted after all the years of singing to support herself and Elsa. For the second time, she decided to stop singing. In 1930, Henry and Kirsten married. They went on a tour through Europe, and at the Vienna State Opera heard Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. It was the first time for Flagstad.
Forestillingen gjorde merkelig nok ikke særlig inntrykk på meg. Etter første akt var jeg nær ved å sovne. Fordi jeg ikke kjente musikken på forhånd, ble det simpelthen for meget Wagner for meg på en aften. Henry ville høre hele operaen, så jeg døset meg gjennom de 2 siste aktene.
2 years later, in 1932, the National Theatre in Oslo decided to stage Tristan and Isolde, and they wanted Flagstad to sing Isolde. Her first reaction was a flat no. She still asked Henry's advice. He held the door open for a continued career.
I løpet av mellom 6 og 8 uker brukte hun til innstudering av Isoldes parti. Et parti som andre sangerinner bruker måneder og år på.
Flagstad's Isolde was a triumph. The New York Metropolitan Opera's European agent asked her to send some reviews and pictures, but she didn't reply. The Met simply didn't interest her. After a few weeks, she received yet another request. And to be polite, she mailed off some material. She was quite irritated and, of course, received no reply.
For å være helt ærlig, så kom ikke jeg tilbake til musikken. Den kom på en måte til meg. Behagelig etablert i mitt nye hjem finner den meg.
Helen Gulbrandsen, the Bayreuth queen, heard Flagstad sing Isolde and was so impressed she wrote immediately to Winifred Wagner in Bayreuth to tell her about Kirsten Flagstad. Flagstad was invited to audition, a request she couldn't ignore. She went to Bayreuth and was engaged. She started out singing smaller parts, as most leading roles were cast long in advance. Her 2 years at Bayreuth were almost an apprenticeship and crucial to Flagstad's career, giving her the chance to learn from more experienced Wagnerians.
Just by chance, I heard her at the Bayreuth Festival in 1934 singing Sieglinde in Die Walküre to the Brünnhilde of Frieda Leider. And I was too young at the time to appreciate the opera or the meaning of the opera, but I still remember the ovation that Kirsten Flagstad received after each act. She received the greatest ovation of anyone in the performance.
In 1934, while she was still at Bayreuth, she received yet another request to audition from the New York Metropolitan Opera. After conferring with Henry, she reluctantly showed up.
Flagstad was not only unknown in America when she arrived in 1935, she was almost unknown throughout most of the musical world, aside from the Bayreuth season she had just done and her work in Scandinavia. And a very last-minute audition was arranged in St. Moritz, where Flagstad went from Bayreuth to be heard by Gary Kazatsa and Artur Bodansky, the conductor. And they engaged her, and the correspondence back to the Met said, "We've heard Flagstad, and we think she'll be all right." And afterwards, everyone explained that they had heard her in her heavily draped room. When Bodansky was conducting his first orchestral rehearsal with her, the story, which is pretty reliable, I think, is that he dropped his baton, the orchestra continued playing, and he rushed to the general manager's office, Gary Kazatsa, and said, "You have to come hear this." So it was only a surprise up until a few days before the debut. The debut on a Saturday afternoon, which a large part of America heard, was one of the great moments in Met history.
Flagstad made her debut at the Met as Sieglinde in Wagner's The Valkyrie. The performance was broadcast nationally, and she was immediately propelled to stardom. On February the 6th, 1935, 4 days after her Metropolitan Opera debut, Kirsten Flagstad sang Isolde. It was a role she would sing 182 times in her career, a role which would always be connected with her name. Kirsten Flagstad and the Danish tenor Lauritz Melchior were the perfect Wagnerian duo of their time. They complemented each other, both artistically and physically.
She never used an extraneous gesture. And when she was alone on the stage or with another group of people, your attention was always riveted on her, not because she was being ostentatious in any way, but because she had this magnetic drawing power. Her acting and her vocal delivery were all melded into one. Whatever was expressed in the text was expressed in her voice and in her movements.
Hun var som en skulptur, altså. Som en stor skulptur. Som sto på scenen og hadde sine bevegelser, essensielle bevegelser. Veldig få, langsomme og med en flott reisning, altså. Det var noe som de ikke hadde sett før. De hadde ikke sett mennesker som så pene ut når de sang de store Wagner-operaene. Og i Tristan og Isolde så ble hun veldig, veldig menneskelig, samtidig som hun ble altså en tragisk heltinne.
When the Met's management realised what a coup they had scored with Flagstad, they quickly changed their plans. She performed in just about everything and sang 7 different parts in 13 weeks. She was given only 11 days to learn the difficult role of Kundry in Wagner's Parsifal.
Etter det hektiske arbeidet med Kundry var jeg nok så utkjørt, og da Kundry i første akt må ligge nesegrus på scenen, oppdaget jeg plutselig at jeg våknet opp etter å ha sovet en kort tid. Jeg blir forresten ofte søvnig av å synge, og har hatt vanskeligheter med å holde meg våken, for eksempel under kong Markes lange monolog i Tristan.
Flagstad was thrown into a marathon of major Wagnerian roles she had never sung before, but learned in record time.
Hvis jeg på det tidspunkt hadde visst hva dette engasjementet skulle føre til, tror jeg nesten jeg på stedet hadde betakket meg. Det betydde at jeg i år fremover skulle stå i rampelyset, mer eller mindre bo i kofferter, og bare arbeide, arbeide, arbeide. Hadde jeg ant dette, undres jeg på om jeg ikke hadde foretrukket litt synging hjemme i Oslo. Men det klart at jeg samtidig var stolt over å ha fått innpass ved verdens fornemste operahus.
The 1935 season was Giulio Gatti Casazza's last as director at the Met. His parting words were, "I've given America 2 great gifts, Caruso and Flagstad." In New York, the Flagstad fever had hit. Her name was on everyone's lips. No magazine or newspaper was printed without mention of Flagstad. Flagstad leaflets were dropped from planes onto New York.
Yeah, in a few minutes.
She was willing to meet all the demands of the Met, but that was not enough. She realized that the American mentality was different. It was difficult to avoid their intrusive enthusiasm and adulation. Her popularity was exploited by high society.
They expected her to come to a party or something afterwards, and she just wouldn't do that very often. She just wanted to go home and be quiet. She was a person who wanted and needed to be alone a great deal. She didn't very often meet people unless she had to. She was a self-contained person.
Hun ble faktisk folkesky, altså. Og det var tragisk, for som hun sier, at i de årene hvor hun sto på toppen av sin berømmelse, og folk gjerne ville, hun forstod godt at de gjerne ville møte henne, men hun klarte ikke å takle det at hun skulle være som en slags utstillingsgjenstand.
Right there.
Hun sier at jeg vet at jeg var veldig streng. Hun sier at jeg synes det er synd, både for meg selv og for mitt amerikanske publikum, at jeg isolerte meg så meget. Og det hadde meget med at hennes datter, Else, som plutselig så sier hun, jeg vil ikke bo her lenger, jeg vil flytte til min far. Og det knuste Kirsten totalt. Og de så hverandre ikke på et år. Hun hørte ingenting til henne.
I think in the beginning when Kirsten first came to America, when Elsa was about 15, I think probably in the beginning it was difficult. Her mother tried in various means of making her happy. She had her come over to America to school for a short time. And Elsa tried for a time traveling with her, but she didn't care for the routine of being on the road and traveling from concert hall to concert hall all the time.
After a year, mother and daughter were reunited. They embraced as if nothing had happened.
I mean, if you could imagine, sort of close your eyes and imagine sort of black velvet, first of all, beautiful black silk velvet. And then on the velvet, there's molten gold, sort of liquid gold sort of running through it. That you have this warm, wonderful, lush sound that has highlights in it. But it's not a metallic sound. The gold is melted, so it's a warm sound in the gold as well. But for me, it is on the recordings, a voice that is so rich and so full and so beautiful and so sure, with light on the top of it.
The major roles which she sang, Isolde and Brunhilde, Tristan and Valkyrie and Götterdämmerung. These major roles having exactly the tessitura, which require low notes, top notes, middle voices, against huge masses of an orchestra. And she had this incredible quality, always above the orchestra, riding any waves. But didn't need to rebalance orchestra very much against her voice. It was another orchestra. You had two orchestras, really. She had a voice like an orchestra. Big voice, was an enormously big voice, but not only big. She could sing very gentle, soft, gentle phrases also. She was a splendid dramatic soprano, probably the greatest in this century.
The voice was ideal for Wagner, there's no question about it. It had this amplitude. And the only way I can describe it accurately is that with many singers, you can fidget in your seat because you're wondering if they're going to make it to the next note. You know? With Flagstad, never. She was a musician who sang. She was first and foremost a musician. And it was God's gift that she had this fantastic instrument that could give expression to what she was trying to portray.
If you haven't heard that voice in a theater, you have no idea from recordings, really, what the impact was. Because, for instance, Birgit Nielsen, who is compared to Flagstad, has what I think we all consider an enormous voice, but it's a voice that goes straight to you. Flagstad was like being in an enormous embrace, or in the center of a bell that was ringing. I mean, it just embraced the auditorium and resounded.
Now she was famous, all America wanted to hear her sing. She sang to an audience of 250,000 in Chicago. Between seasons at the Metropolitan, she performed at other opera houses throughout the world, including Covent Garden in London, one of her favourites. When the opera and concert seasons were over, she went back to Norway to rest and be with her family, especially Henry, who spent most of his time in Norway, apart from 1 or 2 trips to America.
Det var mannen i hennes liv. Og som hun sa, altså jeg har alltid bøyet meg for min manns ønsker. Og det gjorde hun. Alltid. Så hvis han hadde sagt, bare antydet at Kirsten, jeg vil helst at du skal være hjemme, sa hun. Simpelthen bare sagt, ja, jeg skal være hjemme. Og la være å synge. Hun var så knyttet til ham, og den kraftkilden, så lenge de to var glad i hverandre, og det var det hele livet, og så lenge hun hadde sin datters kjærlighet, så kunne hun gjøre det utrolige.
September 1939. Flagstad had spent the summer in Norway, but didn't want to delay her return to America, despite the rising tension in Europe. She had a contract with the Metropolitan for 1 more season, and you don't break contracts. She comforted herself, thinking she'd only be away for 6 months. Her return ticket was already booked for April the 20th, 1940.
Så kom 9. april. Og da var hun i Cleveland på turné med Metropolitan, hun og Melchior. Og da fikk hun meldingen om at Norge, de to, om at Danmark og Norge var okkupert av tyskerne. Og hennes første tanke, hun har bebreidet seg selv siden for det, men hun kunne ikke tenke annerledes. Hennes første tanke var at nå kan jeg ikke reise hjem.
Nortra skip tok jo alle norske skip, så hennes returbillett til Oslo ble jo bare annullert. Henry Johansen skrev at bare bli der du er, for jeg har det bra, og alle har det bra. Men så etter hvert som krigen gikk sin gang, så ble tonen litt annerledes, og så begynte han å kom hjem, kom hjem.
Jeg var dypt ulykkelig over å være kommet i et slikt dilemma. Slitt mellom 2 plikter. Mot min mann, og mot min kunstneriske samvittighet og mitt publikum. Til slutt la jeg egne ønsker til side, og bestemte meg for å bli i Amerika og fullføre mine engasjementer, som skulle være avsluttet innen 17. april 1941. Ingen kunne da si at jeg hadde brutt noen kontrakter.
Many people tried to convince Flagstad to stay in America. Among her visitors at the Waldorf Astoria, former President Herbert Hoover tried to convince her not to go home to the difficulties of life in occupied Norway. As usual, Flagstad wouldn't change her mind. Meanwhile, her daughter Elsa had married and was living in America. Before her final return to Norway, one of the last things she did, as so often before, was to perform for charity. This time, a benefit for Finland. In 1941, after 6 consecutive and exhausting seasons at the Metropolitan, she made a final decision to go back to Norway. It was a decision she paid for dearly later, both in Norway and abroad. Kirsten Flagstad's homecoming marked the beginning of a very difficult period in her life and career. Her fellow countrymen couldn't accept her personal reasons for returning to an occupied country. The strength of her feelings did not matter. Flagstad had forgotten her position as one of Norway's leading performers. Her presence seemed to lend comfort to the enemy. That she also sang German music, worse, Wagner, was held against her. It did not help that her husband belonged to Quisling's fascist party, NS.
Så Henry, han ble medlem av NS i begynnelsen av 30-årene, som så mange andre høyreorienterte forretningsmenn, som var livredd for Russland og falt for Quisling før krigen.
Men så reiste hun og Henry til Kristiansand, hvor de altså hadde slått seg ned på Amalienborg, i nærheten av hans fabrikk. Og der ble hun under hele krigen. Og det var nok ikke så helt lett. Hun hadde ingen forbindelse med Else, hun hadde ingen forbindelse med sine amerikanske venner. Hun hadde ingen forbindelse med utlandet, ingen post nådde henne, så hun satt mer eller mindre som en fange på Amalienborg.
Da hun kom hjem, så sier stedatteren til henne, Kirsten, kan ikke du må få far til å melde seg ut av NS. Så spør hun, er det så galt å stå der? Hun skjønte ikke mer av politikk. Ja, jeg skal gjøre det når du ber om det. Og hun fikk han til å melde seg ut av NS.
Jeg tror ikke Kirsten Flagstad har vært klar over den posisjonen hun hadde. Det var jo en verdensstjerne, og hun skjønte vel kanskje ikke at hvis hun reiste hjem, så ville det bli kjent over hele Amerika. Så det er klart vår ambassadør Morgenstjerne, for han passet det forferdelig dårlig. Og det satt nok i ham så lenge han levet, at dette skulle hun aldri ha gjort. Og det var nok vanskelig for ham å se dette at hun hadde vært i utlendighet helt fra 1934, og ville jo hjem. Han har vel hatt vondt for å skjønne hennes følelser og syn. Hun hadde en mann hjemme som hun var glad i, og mente at det var riktig å reise.
May the 8th, 1945, Norway was free once more. On May the 13th, Henry was arrested without warning by the Norwegian Home Guard. He was accused of financial treason and sent to Ilebu, a detention center for traitors. He later became sick and died there in 1946 before his case came to court. But Flagstad was never to see her husband again. After the war, Kirsten Flagstad was denied an exit visa and passport as the Norwegian authorities wanted to keep her available as a witness against her husband. Their combined fortunes were seized. The court even suggested that the money she had in New York bank accounts, earned by singing with the Metropolitan, was not really hers, but her husband's.
Og det kunne man si til om en sangerinne som på den tid hadde verdens høyeste honorar.
Efter min mening så kunne man jo ikke klandre Kirsten Flagstad for hennes manns disposisjoner, forretningstransaksjoner i Norge. Det er jo helt sikkert at Kirsten Flagstad opptrådte jo overhodet ikke i Norge under krigen. Og det ble sagt at hun var invitert av Terboven, man forsøkte seg med. Og når ryktene da kom til Amerika, så ble det jo sagt både det ene og andre. Da var det en nazist, og det var ikke grenser, så ryktene gikk jo helt vilt.
Og å holde verdens største sangerinne fanget i Norge, selv om hun var på frifot, i 2 år, som kunne ha vært de siste i hennes tilværelse som sanger, hvis et eller annet hadde klikket helsemessig under den påkjenningen som hun ble offer for. Så vil det er en forbrytelse for meg å behandle et menneske slik at hun ikke engang fikk bruke sine gudegaver til å synge Norge inn i verdens hjerte. Mens jeg satt der og tenkte på det, jeg kan ikke skjønne hvem som kan klare å få henne ut av landet. Og så kom jeg plutselig på det. At den eneste menneske som kan få Kirsten ut av landet, er den mannen som fikk Quisling dømt til døden. For han vil de tro på. Og da ringte jeg til Kirsten og sa dem med det samme. Ring til Neusjø, det er den eneste som kan gjøre noe. Det ble gjort, og det gikk.
Flagstad was able to return to her career in 1947, and the first big concert was held at the Royal Albert Hall in London. The English audience, with which she had always enjoyed great rapport, gave her a standing ovation. In March 1947, Flagstad travelled to America again, completely unprepared for the controversy she created. The newspapers were bursting with rumours, for example, that she had performed for Hitler. It was no easy task for Flagstad's manager to arrange concerts for her. Many said they didn't want to hear Flagstad, and at several concerts she was met by big demonstrations.
It's a terribly difficult time to talk about, you know, for those of us who admired her and trusted in her. As it is with anyone who's accused of something that they're not guilty of. And I don't think there's any question about it, that she was absolutely innocent of those charges. And of course, it was the time, too. It was such a tense time. Emotions were high.
Flagstad's only consolation was to see her daughter, whom she hadn't seen for 6 years, and her little grandchild.
Because she returned to New York in recital at Carnegie Hall in 1947, and I was there. There was a line of pickets from 7th Avenue down the street, all carrying placards. And I remember one said, send Brunhilde back to Valhalla. The hall was sold out, and of course she hadn't sung in New York for 6 years. And when she came on the stage, there were 3,000 people in the hall, and I've never forgotten it. Every single person in the hall stood up when she came on stage, just like one person. The whole audience just got to their feet. And it was so emotional, and it was overwhelming, and she stood there just motionless, you know. She had such wonderful control.
Jeg ville ikke gi opp før jeg hadde bestemt meg for å gi opp. Ingen skulle tvinge meg til å slutte å synge. Det skulle være min avgjørelse og ingen annens.
She heard nothing from the Metropolitan. Managing Director Edward Johnson had no plans to invite Kirsten Flagstad back.
I've looked through a lot of the Edward Johnson correspondence, and it's obvious to me that he was more interested in having an easy time running his opera house rather than having the best singers possible. And immediately after the war, everyone began to ask when Flagstad would come back. And his standard reply was that since it was controversial, he was not going to take a stand, so he wasn't going to take her back. But of course, that's taking a stand. When Rudolf Bing was appointed as general manager in 1949, one of the first things he did was to begin negotiations for bringing Flagstad back. And he knew it would be controversial, and in his career at the Met, he, in many ways, thrived on controversy. And this is one of the things that he just would not let go. She came back in the Isolde in January. And it was just overwhelming. I never heard her before the war, of course, but I heard her in that season. And certainly it gave me a sound for my ears that no one has come close to ever since, and I'm sure they won't.
Jeg husker hvordan applausen brøt løs og bare fortsatte mens teppet gikk opp for første akt. Men der jeg lå på Isoldes leie, ønsket jeg bare at de ville holde opp med klappingen så jeg kunne få begynt å synge. Det var gått 10 år siden jeg sist hadde sunget på Metropolitan. Det forundret meg at jeg ikke var mer glad over å være tilbake. Jeg følte snarere triumf enn glede. Viktigst for meg var at jeg var blitt bedt om å komme tilbake.
When Flagstad came back, she did a ring cycle, Tristan, and Fidelio. And those were supposedly her last Met performances. And even after the last one, they said she was not coming back. But in fact, they had already arranged for her to do a series of Alcestis performances in English the following season. I think in many ways, Flagstad is the most important single figure in Met history. It's very easy to imagine Met history without the spectacular singers of the first season in the 1880s, without Caruso even, because the Met by the 20th century was a going concern. What Flagstad did was, in effect, save opera in America at a time when the entire country was financially depressed and opera was not terribly interesting to many people. And what happens when you get a strong box office figure like Flagstad, suddenly not only their performances are interesting, but everything is more interesting. So that Flagstad, in effect, saved the Met. Flagstad came and was the center of everything.
I think that any singer that has gone anywhere near any of the repertoire that was done by Kirsten Flagstad has been influenced by her sound. We are not able to imitate it, of course, and we don't try. But I think one would like to be able to have this sureness of technique and this wonderful control that was so evident in all of her singing.
Jeg betraktet aldri syngingen som en metode eller vitenskap. Vanligvis oppnådde jeg total avslappning før en forestilling med en serie lange og tilfredsstillende gjesp.
I think that the secret of this voice was her emotional and physical stamina and energy. I think that she had an incredible strength inside of herself. This is apart from a wonderful, incredible voice. I think that it had to do with the fact that she was a very stable person and that she was very sure musically and that she wasn't at all worried about it. She knew the work, she knew the music, she was physically capable of doing it. Her voice was like nothing else that one has ever heard before. I think that gives one a great deal of confidence.
In 1953, she brought her career to a close with a farewell concert at the National Theatre in Norway. Luckily, she had broken her old promises of no more performances for me. What she achieved in all those years of concerts and recordings is a whole chapter in the history of music.
We recorded Rheingold, and she sang Fricke. And what I remember, when we had session, I'll never forget that, session at 10 o'clock in the morning, the whole cast, young cast, we cannot sing at 10 o'clock. She was the only one who could sing at 10 o'clock in the morning. Incredible material, like an ice bear, you know. The voice was a nature voice, indestructible, totally indestructible. I never had anybody else in my life this kind of like Stradivari quality, that in every register it sounded well. She was a wonderful worker, never too much, repeat that, never complained anything. I had marvelous time with her. She was already nearly 60 when we recorded the Rheingold, so she was not a young chicken, in a splendid shape.
Kirsten Flagstad var jo en veldig sammensatt personlighet, og hun ble oppfattet som en sky kvinne. Hennes image var så helt spesielt at hva Greta Garbo og har vært i filmens verden, har Kirsten Flagstad vært og fremdeles i sangens verden.
She was a happy person, you know. The impression of her, she smiled a great deal. She had this high laughing. She was a happy person. I might even that maybe it was just put on show because maybe she wasn't so happy. I don't know.
In 1958, Kirsten Flagstad was asked by the Norwegian Opera to be its first director. Sadly, she had to resign in only 2 years. From 1959 onwards, she was in and out of the state hospital in Oslo. An illness, bone cancer, had finally caught up with her. Her hospital stays grew longer and longer. On December the 7th, 1962, Kirsten Flagstad died. Her wish to be buried quietly was respected. There is no tombstone to mark her grave. Her final resting place is unknown. That was how she wanted it.
Å lete etter dystre motiver og hemmeligheter i min personlighet eller i mitt liv å lete etter noe som ikke der. Jeg og har alltid vært det jeg sier jeg Skuffende kanskje, for enkelte mennesker som hadde foretrukket å finne en glamorøs og mystisk kvinne. Jeg kan ikke hjelpe for det. Bortsett fra mitt arbeide jeg en helt vanlig kvinne.